Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hi, I'm Richard Karn, and you may have seen me on TV talking about the world's #1 expandable garden hose. Well, the brand new Pocket Hose Copperhead with Pocket Pivot is here, and it's a total game changer. Old-fashioned hoses get kinks and creases at the spigot, but the Copperhead's Pocket Pivot swivels 360 degrees for full water flow and freedom to water with ease all around your home. When you're all done, this rust-proof anti-burst hose shrinks back down to pocket size for effortless handling and tidy storage. Plus, your super light and ultra-durable Pocket Hose Copperhead is backed with a 10-year warranty. What could be better than that? I'll tell you what, an exciting radio-exclusive offer just for you. For a limited time, you can get a free Pocket Pivot and their 10-pattern sprayer with the purchase of any size Copperhead hose. Just text WATER to 64,000. That's WATER to 64,000 for your 2 free gifts with purchase. WATER to 64,000.
By texting 64,000, you agree to receive recurring automated marketing messages from Pocket Hose. Message and data rates may apply. No purchase required. Terms apply. Available at pockethose.com/terms.
Welcome back to Drafting the Past. I'm your host, Kate Carpenter, and in each episode, I interview a historian about their writing process to learn how the magic happens. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Padraic Scanlan.
Well, thanks for having me.
Padraic is an associate professor at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on the history of labor in Britain and the British Empire. He's the author of 3 books, including Freedom's Debtors, British Anti-Slavery in Sierra Leone in the Age of Revolutions, and Slave Empire, How Slavery Made Modern Britain. His newest book out this year is called Rot, An Imperial History of the Irish Famine, and it offers a reinterpretation of the Irish Great Famine of the mid-1800s. It shows how massive inequality, debt, housing prices, precarious employment, and more contributed to the disaster, all things that sound awfully familiar today. I spoke with Padraic about how he thinks about writing for a general audience, his work with a developmental editor and why he loves editors in general, and his writerly inspirations. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Padraic Scanlan.
Yeah, I mean, I think I initially didn't intend to be an historian. I think I had planned insofar as I had a plan of any kind on working in journalism, but I quickly learned at McGill, where I went in Canada, I'm Canadian, the best way to be a journalist in Canada is to have a parent, ideally 2 parents who already work in journalism in Canada. It is completely impossible to break into. So, I was working a series, it's like university's cheap in Canada, especially if you go to school in the province where you live, where you're from. So I was working a series of crummy service jobs. And then I, kind of stumbled backwards into graduate school in history. Which is something that I would never recommend to an undergraduate. And it's actually kind of crazy that one of my mentors at McGill said, you should go to graduate school in history. And then I was like, well, where should I go? And anyway, so I kind of stumbled backwards into it. And, as I was working, I wrote my dissertation. I wrote an academic book called Freedom's Debtors, which was based on my dissertation, which was published by Yale. And I kept trying to break into popular writing, or at least writing history for a general audience. I've always kind of admired the model of staking a claim to an academic argument through a peer-reviewed article and then writing a book for a bigger audience that expands on that argument. So, I got lucky, basically. I kept pitching book reviews, and essays, nothing. And then a senior colleague of mine basically punted a book review that they didn't want to do to me for The Guardian. And I just ripped the book apart, which I now understand you're never supposed to do. Every book review, it's even worse in academic journals where every book is a masterpiece. Every argument is a gem. But I didn't understand you're not supposed to actually criticize books in book reviews. So I ripped it apart, and then I got an email from the editor or the director of the publishing house, basically sort of saying, like, do you want to write a book? And so I wrote Slave Empire based on that, which was sort of based on a lecture course that I gave at the London School of Economics, which is where I started my career. I was an assistant professor there for 5 years. And then from there, while, it did okay, or at least it did okay for a mid-list general audience book, good enough to get a contract for another book called Rot, which is about the Irish famine. And I'm also working now, and now, I've sort of have a much more solid foundation in terms of that world of writing for a general audience. So, I have now representation. I have a more, let's say, a much less naive perspective on how publishing actually works. Because I thought, having published in academic journals, having published an academic book, I just sort of I just knew it. But it really doesn't work like that. So I've sort of ended up doing the thing that I wanted to do by accident over time.
I always think that reviewers should maybe feel free to be a little more critical of books. Do you still review now that you've published a couple books for a public audience?
I write fast. That's perhaps I don't think particularly clearly, but I write really fast and I deliver clean copy. So yeah, I do academic reviews. I do reviews for magazines and books and stuff like that. I review books, but I understand why, like, the academic publishing is collapsing, right? We do it for free, right? It's a thing that you do for free. And, not everybody, but, if you have a name, a rich person's name in front of the word professor in your title, you're probably not writing book reviews. Or if you are, you're writing book reviews of your friends, right? And you have every reason to, so a lot of grad students end up having, and I wrote book reviews as a grad student, and you're not going to criticize a book as a grad student. And if you're a reviewer, you don't want to criticize someone's first book. It's their whole career, right? There's so many reasons. Like, I still write much more critically. I will say I write much more critically in reviews for not academic presses, for general audiences than I do in academic reviews. In academic reviews, I'm never going to pan a book because I know, I don't usually get assigned like the big books, capital B, and the big feature reviews where you have, you're not going to hurt somebody who's already in that position. But if I'm going to sign a book review for a journal, right, like, that's someone's career on the line.
Sure.
And I'm not going to torpedo their career for the sake of, so you end up kind of soft pedaling reviews. But yeah, I still do it. I like it. I have one waiting actually when I get back to Toronto. I've got a book to read and review.
Well, let's talk about kind of your process. When and where do you like to do your writing?
So, I think, as I was saying, like, I can't say that insofar as, like, I can't say in terms of the kind of gifts that profit an historian. I can't say that I have a particularly intuitive like, I have colleagues who understand historiography far more, they just understand it far more intuitively. They have much more recall. They have a much greater sense of the field. I'm not trying to pretend like I don't have a sense of the field. don't tell the University of Toronto I don't have a sense of the field. But that's not a strength of mine. But I do write quickly, and I am able to, it turns out, synthesize arguments pretty well. And I don't need particularly, I don't need a lot of special circumstances, or, I don't need a particularly kind of cultivated environment to write. So I'm able to write, I'm able to kind of switch into, so I write a lot at our house. What I usually do when I'm beginning a book project. So I'm working on a book project now tentatively called The Day's Work, which will be published eventually by, hopefully, if they like it, it will be published by Profile Books sometime in the future. And so for that, I have, what I like to do is just gather huge quantities of primary material and secondary material in just Word files, and then kind of figure out a point in those files and start writing, right? Start transforming, like going through, and I'll keep the basic, right? I'll keep a copy of the pristine file in case I need to go back. And I always format, over time, I've learned to kind of format the footnotes, whether they're archival or primary sources or secondary sources. I use Zotero. So I keep the Zotero codes in so I don't have to do it later. But then I kind of work through chunks of text and kind of digest the primary and secondary sources from the inside out. And then I like to, when I'm writing something, and I think that's the same process no matter what length of piece I'm writing, as long as it's research based. Like if I'm reviewing a book or writing an essay, I'll usually read the book and write paragraphs as I go, like pick some quotations and say this is an important point, and then go back and turn that into a finished product. But if it's a book length or article length project based on research, I basically follow the same process except with longer documents. So I probably have, for Rot, I probably had 250,000 words, 350,000. I'm not sure how long it was. It was like a six or 700 page Word document of, and I have different ways of tagging. So if it's an argument that I'm making, I put it in square brackets. If it's something that seems like it really has to go in, like sometimes a line jumps out at you and you say, this has to be in the book. I usually put that highlighted in one color. If it's a section, if it's an argument from another historian that seems analytically important, I'll highlight that in another color so that when I go through that document, I won't miss those things. Because those are things that as I'm working, I'm like, this has to go into the book, this has to go into the article. And whether that ends up being, a paragraph or a page or even just a footnote, I've kind of flagged. And then I just sort of sit down and write through it. And then when I have a rough draft, then I try to get the rough drafts produced as quickly as I can and spend a lot more time refining them than actually drafting them. And actually, when I was a grad student at Princeton, I worked in the Princeton writing program for a really long time. I did like hundreds and hundreds of hours of one-on-one writing tutorials with undergrads and grad students. And I learned a lot actually from the professional development program that they had in the writing program about just how to not be precious about first drafts, right? To not pretend that the first thing that you produce is going to be crystalline and perfect, but recognize that everything is a first draft and that there's no such thing as a final draft. And I teach writing at Toronto. I teach a writing intensive class that's an introductory kind of the equivalent of sort of a writing program seminar at an American university for first year students that's about labor studies. And it's the same, I follow the same model and it's the same kind of basic principles. Like, don't be ashamed of your first draft ever, but also don't pretend that writing, especially nonfiction writing, but fiction writing as well, is this kind of divine inspiration, and that to criticize someone's writing, to edit someone's writing is to somehow make a claim about their personhood, right? Like it's a craft. And, some people have more natural aptitude for it than others, but anyone can write clearly. And so, if you can think, so that's, I don't have any particularly sophisticated process, and I'm lucky that I can like kind of switch in and out. So, if I've got a meeting on campus and like drop the kids off at school by 9 and I've got to get in by 12, I can actually sit down at home and write or work on the manuscript or work on a manuscript for that 90-minute chunk of time, and then be able to just kind of save it and move on.
How do you like to organize your primary sources? What tools do you use? Is that Zotero as well?
Yeah, I use Zotero. I got to say, I did a much better job of organizing. So, I think one of the things about both Rot and Slave Empire, so Slave Empire is in the UK, and I was digesting. So Slave Empire is in many ways like a synthetic book. There are parts of it that were very original research that I'm really proud of. And it's maybe like a little bit nettled that nobody picked up on in the reviews, whatever. So I think insofar, like a lot of that stuff is based on just huge quantities of reading of printed primary sources, especially of the records of emancipation in the British Empire, which, I think if you're reading a book about emancipation in the British Empire and you check the footnotes and you see those CO call letters for colonial office papers, understand that almost everything related to emancipation was also published. And so it may be an affectation on the part of the historian to show that it's a manuscript, even though every word of those manuscripts was transcribed and published in volume after volume after volume after volume. So, I try to, when I was doing my PhD research, I had an incredibly elaborate file system, and I'm not sure that it advantaged me at all. And so now I just keep it in one document. And if I have photographs from archives, I keep those in, sorted files. But yeah, I use Zotero for file management. And if something is outside of Zotero, I make sure to flag it so that it doesn't end up being a kind of error that gets buried in the text and then I'm never able to find it again. But yeah, Zotero is a lifesaver. I remember vividly, like that was, yeah. When I was in Cégep, because I'm from Quebec, and in Quebec you go to everyone goes to community college between high school and university, either for a 3-year trade program or a 2-year pre-university program. And I had a teacher in Cégep who did research methods, and she had this system of how you write, sort of how you format notes that I still use. in terms of, especially when I'm using library books with like the call number in the top right corner, and then all kinds. And so I still have my notes from generals in grad school were organized that way across like 6 dozen notebooks. But I used to do everything longhand, but I've stopped doing that. It's completely unworkable.
Sure. Where in your research and reading process do you like to start writing?
I think when things stop being surprising. Sometimes that's quick. Sometimes that takes a long time. When I start to see stuff that, if I start to see things that shocked me or surprised me or seemed unusual to me at first, if I start seeing them repeated, I think then it's usually time to start writing. So, for example, like in Slave Empire, when I was or in Rot, I started writing once it was clear that I had, like, Rot is divided into two parts, right? And I wrote them at different paces. One part is about kind of framing the context of the famine, which is something that very few books about the famine do particularly well, at least in my, I'm not trying to cast it. If you wrote a book about the famine, your book does it perfectly. But I'm not talking about you. But you know what I mean? But there are a lot of books about the famine that kind of start, in August 1945, in August 1845, right, with the discovery of blended potatoes in Ireland. So the first half of the book was about trying to put together the world from about the 1780s, but a little bit before, in terms of just like, I do a really quick pre kind of 1770s, 1780s history up until 1845. And then the second part was just laying out the second part of the book re-engages with those themes, but it follows a more conventional trajectory of the famine from 45 to 1851. And so, like, it was easier to start writing the second half of the book than the first, because I knew, there are so many books about the famine. There's so many good narrative histories of the famine that I knew the beats, right? I knew what the beats of the narrative would be in a way that I didn't completely know what the beats of the world building part of the book would be. So, as soon as I start to get the feeling that I'm really repeating myself, or when I'm reading secondary sources and I'm getting the same arguments back and forth at each other again and again, then I can kind of say, okay, this is a time when if I've missed something, I can always go back. But I have enough material now that if I start, I can make some serious progress. So it depends. It really depends on once I start getting that feeling.
Yeah, I know you embrace sort of messy first drafts and getting it down on the page. So then what on a practical level does the revision process look like for you? How do you tackle it?
So I usually work through the draft from the beginning. I break it into chapters. If I'm writing an academic article, I break it into sections, and I kind of have each section, with a line break or page break. And I work from the top through to the bottom and try to just cut and cut and cut and cut. I overwrite usually because I don't want to miss anything. And then I recognize, and if something seems really good, like I still have a file from my doctoral dissertation, which someday I can come back to, of just because I wrote about colonial Sierra Leone in my dissertation in my first book. And there were a lot of animal attacks in colonial Sierra Leone. So I still got none of them made it into the book. None of them, I don't even think any of them made it into the dissertation, but I've still got a file of animal attacks because they just seem too good. I may never do anything with them, but I do have them. So if something, sometimes if it's just, you can just cut it and, you have and so I work through the draft from top to bottom. And I try to spend most of my time, it's another kind of writing seminar tick on the introduction, right? Whether the introduction is a paragraph or whether it's 5 pages or 10 pages or however long, to make sure that the introduction is super, super clear before I move to the rest of the text. Because when the introduction is clear, it cuts both ways. On the one hand, then you have a scaffolding that you can lay the rest of your work on, right? And you can know, okay, well, I said I'm going to do this. So I've made a contract with the reader that I'm going to give them this information. So I have to put it in. And also they're really forgiving. Like a clear introduction can really make more sloppy argument seem really clear. So it cuts both ways. But then I work through and, I read the drafts. It takes me a long time I spend more time, I would say, refining than I do. I would say the longest periods, it kind of follows sort of like a bell curve shape, right? Because I spend tons of time gathering information. I write as quickly as I can, knowing that it's going to be really messy. And then I spend a really long time revising. So the actual drafting process, I try to do it quickly, so that it just like psychologically, it's reassuring to me to know that like I'm not going to be able to turn into my publishers, who are expecting 100,000 or 95,000 word book with 5,000 words of notes or whatever. I can't turn in a 150,000 square bracketed mess. But knowing that I have it, that's like a neurosis from undergrad and from high school. Just like I would always set artificial deadlines for myself that were ahead of just infuriating everybody. I was just like, "Are you done your essay?" It's like, "Yeah, I'm done my essay," because I wrote it 2 weeks into the semester as a draft. And I'm going to come back to it later. That's like a bit of an exaggeration, but not much. I'd rather have a really like lumpy, garbagey draft ready that I know I can find something in, rather than like I have colleagues and friends who take forever to draft, but then their first drafts are really good. My first drafts aren't good, so I think there's more than one way to skin a cat. But I prefer to work fast and then edit more slowly.
As you've mentioned, Rot is your third book. It's your second book with a popular press aimed at a general audience. What'd you learn in your first book?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the process. So, I think like Freedom's Debtor is my first book, my academic book, has some, I think my supervisor and mentor at Princeton, Linda Colley, writes in a way that I think I emulate, and I think all of her students emulate really self-consciously or unself-consciously. And so, there's a pattern to the way that she writes. There's a pattern to the way that many of her students write. There's a pattern to the way that I write, right? Like so my dissertation is not by any stretch of the imagination a popular book, but it has some of the features of a popular book that appear in Rot and in Slave Empire, right? So a lot of the chapters begin with a very kind of cultural anthropology style or historical anthropology style. You're suddenly put in a place, right? And you're put in either through the eyes of a person, or, if you're feeling like creative, you can do, there's only really one chapter in Roth that doesn't follow that pattern. And it starts with a joke, right? It starts with a setup to a like, how many potatoes could the Irishman eat, which is my favorite chapter of Rot, the People's Potato. But I sort of set myself, and so I had an idea of what it meant to write a trade book. But then when I started writing it, I had a little bit of extra research money at LSE. And so I hired an editor whose name is Pamela Hogg, who I highly recommend, who specializes in helping academics kind of recognize what parts of their books are appealing to a general audience, and helping academics to keep their arguments sophisticated and interesting and true to the guild, without making them impenetrable and tedious for a popular audience who maybe doesn't necessarily understand stakes. And so I sent her the manuscript for Slave Empire, and she did a really good job, kind of just sort of seeing the things that she cut, and her explanations for why she cut the things she cut was really, really helpful with Slave Empire. And there are still some elements of Slave Empire when I read it. I can see that there are things that I'm doing. I have another editor who I've worked with on magazine pieces, because I think it's like, I think the idea that you shouldn't have editing help is insane. Right. And the idea that like the idea, again, I think it's the same sense of like writing as this expression of selfhood. But you think like the best, or even the most kind of lyrical, to use maybe an overused adjective about historical writing, even some of like the most lyrical writers of fiction, like the idea that they don't have an editor who's helping them refine their ideas is not true, right? Like every good writer has a good editor. So seeing what Pamela cut helped me understand what I should cut. And there's still some elements of Slave Empire that I was giving. Sorry, I got a little off track, but I have an editor I've worked with on nonfiction pieces for magazines, who always calls it giving out bouquets, right? And academic writers love to give out bouquets because I do it all the time in academic writing. You like give the name of an historian because you admire their work, or you went to graduate school with them, or you're their buddy, or you want to get their attention, right? We're always doing this complex, because we live in the social world of academic history. And so we're flagging, but like general readers don't care. Like they really don't care. And so one of the things that Pamela helped me to do was to understand where someone's work is important enough that you should say, so-and-so, an historian at such and such university, famous for XYZ argument, and when you can just kind of put that in the footnotes, even if it means that you're no longer, even if it means that you're taking away a bouquet, you know? So that was the process with, and there's still some elements of Slave Empire that have that kind of, so for example, one of the things that I do in Slave Empire that was cut from the book, is I wondered, like, should I have a really long explanation at the beginning of the book for the language that I use, which is something that a lot of academic histories of slavery and emancipation use, right? Like, should you use, for example, so why throughout the book I write enslaved person, right? Although I am skeptical, I have a different view about like enslaver, which has become sort of in the field the expected term for slaveholder. But I use slaveholder, and I had a long explanation for why I do that, right? Because I recognize that is at the time was slightly out of step with the field, and now has become quite out of step with the field. And so if I'm writing an academic book or something academic where I'm writing about enslavement and emancipation, like I'm going to either use those conventional terms or have an essay at the beginning of my piece explaining why I'm using the terms I'm using, because I'm not using the conventional terms. But one of the things that got cut from Slave Empire is like, just use enslaved person, right? Just use enslaved laborer, and readers will understand, like, and count on readers to kind of understand that rhythm, so that's one of the things, like it's trying to figure out the things that are crucial for academic writing that can be occluded or submerged in general, in writing for a general audience, that will still be there, right? Like, so you don't want to just kind of switch to the most retrograde language imaginable, because like that's what the people want, because people don't really, I think, you're telling them what they want in a way, like you're telling them how they should think about the past, or giving them a version of thinking about the past that you want them to take on board or consider. But at the same time, the academic debate about terminology or the academic debate about historiography is something for professionals, rather than for general readers. So it really helped with that. I feel like I did better with Rot from the outset, in part because, and this might come out in the reviews of Rot, who knows? I'm not an historian, or I'm an historian of the British Empire, right? I'm a historian of labor, especially, I spent the better part of my career at this point working on enslaved labor and the transition, especially moments of transition from enslaved to free labor. That was my, the vast majority of my scholarly output has been on that theme. And so I had to teach myself Irish history. And I have my family is us like diasporic Irish, but not in any kind of meaningful way, right? Like, especially not, I think it was like Irishness, I think was much more important to my dad and his family. Like my mom was French Canadian, like really old, pure laine French Canadian. So, I have this insane Irish name, but I don't feel that much, in a way, like part of Rot was like trying to understand that history and trying to digest that diasporic identity insofar as I have it. And so I think Rot, like I was easier to make it a trade book because there are a lot of books written about the famine. There are a lot of articles written about the famine. And there's an especially rich and enormous archive of local histories of the famine, right? So you can understand what happened between 1845 and 1851 in really close detail in a lot of very specific places in Ireland. And in a way, like I had the completely unearned confidence of the what's the term of the dilettante, right? Like I know the historiography of the British Empire in this era, but this was my first real deep dive into Ireland. And so Rot was a little easier to write. And I think I had help again. I hired Pamela again to edit the manuscript, but it was, the process. I feel like I'm getting better at it. And the book I'm working on now, I think, will be easier too. I can kind of see the beats, see the structures, understand the length of each chapter, understand the way chapters can fit together, understand you can have more chapters. Although, like, again, following in very self-conscious imitation of Linda Colley, I tend to write books with really long chapters, a small number of really long chapters, with like a broad type. Anyway, yeah, so it's getting easier.
To talk a little more concretely about how Padraic wrote this book, I asked him to record an excerpt from it and then answer some questions. Here's Dr. Padraic Scanlan reading from Chapter 5 of Rot, An Imperial History of the Irish Famine.
Early in William Carleton's novel, The Black Prophet, a melodrama set during the 1817 potato failure, the prophecy man, Donald Dhu, sees a rainstorm and predicts starvation. The water, he explains, will kill potatoes and soften the earth for grave digging. The heavy clouds are death hearses moving slowly along. The novel appeared in serial in the Dublin University magazine between May and December 1846. So it should be May 1845 and December 1846. A pastiche of childhood memories from 1817 and reporting from 1845, Carleton hoped that Black Prophet would make the suffering of the Irish poor vivid to his readers, with fictional scenes presented, quote, in the midst of living testimony. However, by midsummer, long before the conclusion appeared in print, it became obvious that the blight had returned, just as virulent as the past years and more widespread. Fewer potatoes were in the ground, and a greater proportion of planted potatoes were destroyed. Inspecting a field in August, a relief official found few potatoes larger than a marble. The familiar putrid smell was everywhere. In the winter of 1846-47, rural Ireland became a hellscape, shocking and incomprehensible. An estimated 400,000 people in Ireland died of causes related to the loss of the 1846 potato crop. Thousands by starvation and hundreds of thousands by disease. The bonds of social life dissolved. Mobs of the hungry marched on work sites and government offices. Parents watched their children die and were too weak properly to mourn them. Children watched their parents die and were too weak to move their bodies. Those who could fled Ireland, a panic beginning to one of the largest waves of European migration in the 19th century. Everyday life collapsed and famine relief efforts stood in pathetic contrast. But Ireland did not suffer in secret. Thanks to faster communications by steamship and occasionally telegraph, though telegraphy was quite new in 1846, and the widespread syndication of articles from London newspapers across the British Empire, in the United States and beyond, the world knew about the ongoing catastrophe in close to real time. Moved by images and stories of Irish suffering, people and organizations around the world donated money and goods to the relief effort. In counterpoint to this public open-handedness, the Whig government that replaced Peel's Conservatives, led by John Russell, fixated on the moral hazard of eleemosynary aid, of giving relief without labor in exchange, even to the starving. Faith in the civilizing power of austerity, and even deeper faith in the power of markets, remain core principles of the response to rapidly deteriorating conditions.
Talk me through how you put these paragraphs together.
So when I was preparing the book, The Black Prophet is not the only famine novel, but it's a really interesting, there's a lot of layers. I'll do my best. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to bring out in the book is the way that the Irish educated middle class had a very different experience of the famine. Right? They experienced it as a trauma, but not in the same. I mean, many of them died of typhus if they helped people who were suffering from starvation, because typhus became epidemic really quickly. But they had a different kind of romantic vision of Ireland that was, in my view at least, not yet particularly deeply rooted among the ordinary working people. And so William Carleton is a really interesting guy, a prolific writer. Somebody whose folkloric writing I delve into in other parts of the book. And he wrote this book, The Black Prophet, which was set in 1817. And so that's important because one of the arguments I make in Rot is that Ireland was very hungry long before the famine. So every season in Ireland was a hungry season, and Ireland had cyclical potato failures that were a consequence of the kind of rise and fall of the potato yields in a kind of natural cycle, especially in a natural insofar as potatoes were almost always monocrops, right? So Ireland had these waves of where a new potato varietal would really quickly spread across the country. And then because all of those potatoes were planted not from seeds, but from cuttings, and so were effectively clones, they were really vulnerable to disease. And so one of the arguments I try to make in Rod is that the 1845, when the first wave of blight struck, was everyone, I think, in Britain and in Ireland recognized that it was a blight that would be of historic scale, but no one imagined that it would be an unprecedentedly long and brutal blight in the way that it was. And so William Carleton, his book, The Black Prophet, is set in the 1817 potato failure, a major potato failure before the famine. And it's this really interesting combination of melodramatic fictional invention and kind of verite reporting on the things that he saw during the first wave of the potato famine. So in 1845, the potatoes failed for the first time. 1845 was a very hard year for the Irish poor, but it was much less hard in comparison to what was to come. But it was brutal. And so Carleton is kind of stitching together things that he remembered from his own childhood living through the 1817 potato failure with things that he saw in 1845 to kind of create this thing, this new kind of fiction. So I was interested, as somebody who's interested in the relationship between fiction and history, to think of this idea of fictional scenes presented in the midst of living testimony, the way that Carleton blends together past and future, because that blending together, that kind of sense, that way of seeing Ireland as a place of timelessness, that way of seeing Ireland as a place where time doesn't move, or time moves more slowly than it does in the rest of the United Kingdom. I think that is a characteristic of British colonialism and of the British colonial attitude towards Ireland. And so I'm trying to evoke it here, not from the side of the British, but from the side of a very kind of sympathetic and much more nationalistic Irish writer rather than a British writer. And so it's also setting the scene to show that everybody thought, like Britain, the United Kingdom poured a lot of resources into Ireland in 1845, thinking that that would be the end. And that in 1846, the potatoes would come back and Ireland would return to its extraordinarily precarious and easily exploited economic conditions. But, things could go back to normal. And so I use Carleton's novel to kind of evoke, something that, like, Carleton is creating a scene that is supposed to be in the past, but in fact, he's evoking a scene that would have definitely, a lot of people in Ireland digging up those potatoes in 1846 would have been, it's a scene of just heartbreak and horror to recognize that, like, the potatoes are dead in the ground. And so I'm trying to evoke that in that first section. And then I'm trying to introduce the argument of this chapter, which is called Black 47, which is what many English-speaking Irish people refer to the year as, right? This winter, the winter of 1846 and 1847 through the summer of 1847, which was really, in some ways, the potato famine didn't end in 1847 by any stretch of the imagination, but that was the year when, and in fact, in some parts of Ireland in 1848 and especially in 1849, there was even worse kind of brutal local typhus and just outbreaks of profound starvation and violence and despair. Like, the potatoes failed in other parts of the country later, but and in some ways worse, right? Like, it was worse in some counties later. But 46-47 was the year in national memory, right? That was when the crisis was at its highest at a national scale. And it was also the moment that kind of set in motion all of the features of the Irish famine that are most relevant to the diaspora, right? So this was the moment when people started leaving. So in Quebec, in Montreal, where I grew up, right, this was this was when the coffin ships set sail from Ireland with, tens of thousands of people aboard a series of steamships, and then when they got and then when they got to the quarantine station in the mouth of the St. Lawrence River near Quebec City, thousands of people were dead, and they were just buried in mass graves. And it was also this moment when rural society absolutely collapsed. And that's really what this chapter is about, Black 47. It's about the contrast between the continuing efforts of the government of the United Kingdom to impose a very specific kind of market-based order on Irish society, in contrast with the absolute devastation and collapse of civil life, right? I think one of the things that is a really good book called Eating People is Wrong about famine by a very famous historian of the Irish famine and of famines in general. So this was the famine. This was the year of rumors of cannibalism. This was the year of children abandoning their parents. This was the year of the kind of thing that held rural Irish society together just coming apart. And so I'm trying to capture that absolute, utter social desolation and contrast it with what was happening in Britain. And what was happening in Britain were two things. First of all was the Russell government, the Whig government led by Lord John Russell, like the government led by Robert Peel, the Conservative government that preceded Russell's government. They were both the Conservatives and the Whigs, in my view, were convinced that the only way to solve Ireland's problems in the long term was to ensure that Irish people lived according to the rules of the market. And I could talk at length about what I mean by that. But suffice to say that Britain believed that Ireland was trapped in the kind of pre-capitalist past. And one of the things I'm trying to emphasize in Rot is that, in fact, Ireland, although it looked old because it was low technology, extraordinarily poor, almost entirely agricultural, So it looked ancient, right? It had this kind of like hedgerows and potato fields. Like it had a sort of aesthetic that was picturesque and old fashioned and atavistic when people visited Ireland. But in fact, it was, I argue, on the kind of bleeding edge of capitalist modernity in the British Empire. So Irish peasants were deeply in debt. Irish peasants made incredibly complicated and very risky bets on whether or not they would earn, whether their pig would get fat enough to sell for rent, whether or not they would sell their potato crop, right? They had these very, these meager assets, right? In the form of pigs, potatoes, and virtually free or almost free peat. So they had free fuel. So they had these very meager assets and they were trying to make complicated decisions in order to survive from season to season. And so one of the big arguments of Rot is that the British government, which included Irish MPs, many of whom agreed, very broadly with the basic principles that Ireland was backward. The British government's only solution to Ireland's crisis was to effectively like pour gasoline on the fire by introducing even more austere policies to encourage the forms of market life that had created the crisis in the first place. And so in 1846, John Russell emphasized public works. So Robert Peel had emphasized importing grain and encouraging the Irish to buy grain to replace the potato, to kind of teach Irish laborers how to use the market. And Russell instead said, okay, now that Peel's government fell because of the fall of the Corn Laws, so now there's free trade across the empire in grain. Russell said, well, we're going to borrow money and establish work sites where people will get money in exchange for doing public works. And what those public works were produced a whole series of complicated debates. But in effect, many of these projects were building kind of roads to nowhere. And in the memory of the famine, in the folk memory of the famine, because one of the sources I use very heavily in Rot is an incredible collection that was assembled by the government of the Irish Free State in the 1930s of folk stories that were collected by, it's called the Schools Collection. Because school kids in the Irish Free State were told to go and interview old people and just kind of record their stories, not just about the famine, but about almost everything. It's an unbelievable resource in both Irish and in English. So in one of these folk stories, people remember these works as like digging holes and filling them back up again, right? So this chapter is about how even in the face of the most obvious crisis, the British government continued to pour money and resources and people into a solution that was not mitigating the Irish crisis, but in fact making it worse. And they did this in the context of probably the first, in some ways, the Irish famine was the first kind of sort of big public humanitarian crisis. So there were globally syndicated articles from the London newspapers and a series of famous etchings depicting the suffering of the Irish. So while this was happening, hundreds of thousands of pounds and dollars and goods were being donated to Ireland. So I'm trying to, in these three paragraphs, it's a long answer, but I'm trying to set up in these three paragraphs, I'm trying to create a vignette that brings readers into the moment of the potato failure in 1846 and try to get them to imagine just the profound sense of foreboding and horror that people would have experienced, putting their hose into the earth in August 1846 and discovering that the potatoes in the ground were like no bigger than marbles and that there was nothing left, while also reminding readers of and explaining to readers like what's going to happen in the chapter. And also reminding readers of the kind of spinal argument of the book about, on the one hand, the British misunderstanding of like how time worked in Ireland and the profound emphasis on the market in how the British Empire responded to the crisis in Ireland. So that's, I'm trying to do a lot there, whether or not it succeeds. I think you have to remember, yeah. So that's, those are those paragraphs.
As you've kind of explained, a lot of the argument in your book revolves around these like political, economic, labor, imperial issues and practices, which is not always in and of itself inherently gripping, right? Like there are a lot of parliamentary debates involved.
Yes.
What were your strategies to make sure both that all that material was clear, that a lay reader could follow it, but also that it was interesting?
That's a good question. And I'm not entirely sure that I succeeded, because like chapter 4 of the book, which is about Peel and about the first wave of the famine, is much more about debates in Parliament than events in Ireland. Because although that first wave of the blight was devastating for Ireland, it was a orders of magnitude less devastating than future waves of blight would be. But it also happened in the context of the very complicated but extremely important debates over the end of the Corn Laws in the United Kingdom, right? The protectionist laws that protected United Kingdom landowners from competition from foreign grain. And so, it sounds like just talking about it has a kind of like soporific effect. But it's hard to overemphasize how profoundly exercised all of Britain was by the debates over the Corn Laws. Like it was a very big deal. And so one of the things I try to do is to kind of look for, one of the things that's lucky about the Irish famine is that as with, it's a huge printed archive, a huge manuscript archive. There are a lot of sources. And so there are and there are also preserved in the sources, a lot of letters from relief officials working on the ground. And the relief officials are some of those letters are really interesting and really fun. And so I use kind of the everyday because a lot of the relief officials who worked in Ireland were half pay naval and Royal Marine and Army officers. So these were, the hard men of the British Empire. Many of them had served in the Peninsular War. So that was a brutal guerrilla fighting up through Spain against Napoleon, right? These were like battle hardened people, but their letters are really affecting because I don't think they were trying to do, like, some of them were immediately deadened, some of them became indulged in graft, but a lot of them tried their best. And so those letters are an important source. The folkloric stuff is an important source. It's also like the head of relief, who kind of is between the world of the bureaucracy and the world of famine relief, is this man, Charles Trevelyan, who is a kind of hate figure in Ireland and not without justice, but who is a very colorful, very strange character, and who is also like I found him. I know him, not personally, obviously, but I know him because he was part of the circle he was a kind of a sort of in a cadet branch of the core elite abolitionist circle, the Wilberforces, the Thorntons, this really tightly, the Macaulays, the Babingtons, this really insular, profoundly incestuous group of abolitionists, whose mindset I think I really understand. And so I understand, and Trevelyan was, an interesting guy. He was, not, he was a true believer. And so Trevelyan helps, right? Because he's a bureaucrat, but he's an exceptionally good writer. And he wrote a history of the famine before it was over, right? He wrote a book called The Irish Crisis that was published when the Irish Crisis was still ongoing. And the argument of the Irish Crisis was effectively to kind of act as the mouthpiece for what John Russell wanted to be true, which was that the Irish crisis is no longer a crisis for the United Kingdom. It is a crisis for Ireland and only Ireland. And so Trevelyan, you can always go back to the Irish crisis for a colorful phrase. So, and also the debates were pretty vicious. And I read there's a lot of very kind of catty diarists who were working in Parliament at the same time. And this was an era of like some very colorful parliamentarians, like Lord Brougham was there with his, and if you've ever read the sketches of Brougham, is like his bellowing stentorian voice, and Peel was there, and Peel is a fascinating chameleon-like kind of sort of like with a smile like a coffin lid is what one of his critics said. And then there's John Russell, who's like 4'10", right? And everybody's kind of making fun of him for being, look, people are shorter in the 19th century, but Russell was unusually short. Like he's depicted in Vanity Fair, like sitting on a bench with his legs dangling, right? So there's some colorful characters there to kind of, to kind of make the medicine go down, because to understand the Irish famine, you need to understand what free trade meant in the British Empire. And at a certain point, like you have to explain that. And it's not that interesting. It's interesting, but it's maybe not that interesting if you're just looking for a narrative history of the Irish famine.
Before I let you go in our last little bit of time, I'd like to hear a little bit about your own writing inspiration. So are there people or books that you turn to for inspiration?
I've said it before, but and she would not like to hear it, but Linda Colley is definitely a deep, deep inspiration on my writing. And actually the sort of coterie of historians who were revered when I was I don't know if it's still the case at Princeton, but when I was in graduate school, there was, Natalie Zeman Davis, Robert Darnton, the kind of historians of early modern and modern Europe, who are deeply influenced by cultural anthropology, by its methods, by its writing style, by its emphasis on thick description. I think that intellectually still structures the way I write history. I'm not great at. I've gotten better. I'm good at synthesizing arguments, right? So I think I've gotten quite decent as a writer at finding, at like reading a lot of books and being able in a paragraph to explain to both academic and general readers what the stakes of those debates are. But it is not my strength to get into the details of academic argument. It's something I can do, but it takes a lot of effort, and the end product is not great. And so, not to say that those historians are much better at it than I am, but that form I look to. In terms of my kind of orientation to the past, I'm still stuck in the 1790s, and I still have a deep, deep regard for the generation of English social historians of the 60s, some of whom are still alive, the kind of E.P. Thompson school. I still think about, I really admire David Cannadine too. Although I don't always agree with his arguments, I admire the way that he's able to write a lot of books, and to switch. And I still think about The Invention of Tradition, the edited collection by Terence Ranger, in which there's a great Terence Ranger essay, there's a great Cannadine essay, there's just so those are kind of, I think about those books, the kind of Natalie Zima Davis school, E.P. Thompson school, for intellectual inspiration. And in terms of writing, my actual writing style, I think it's the first two writers that I read as a teenager that I recognized as having a distinct style. And I said, as nonfiction writers. And this is going to seem a little off the page, but there's a pop culture writer named Cintra Wilson, who has kind of fallen off a bit, but she wrote an amazing book. I don't know if she's fallen off or just she's moved on to other projects, but she wrote an amazing book called A Massive Swelling, Celebrity Reexamined as a Grotesque Crippling Disease, which I have several copies of, and which I reread all the time. And I just love her ability to just like select really pungent adjectives and like lay them out in a line. And so you'll see that in my writing all the time. Which is borrowed directly from this writer about pop culture. I think is very like a brilliant stylist and a really interesting writer. And the other is Orwell, which sounds cliched, but you know who you're reading when you read Orwell. And in some ways, Orwell is like the restrictions that he places on his own writing are not restrictions that I place, right? So I'm not committed to always choosing like a shorter word when a longer one is available. I'm not committed to never using Latin words unless I absolutely have to, right? Like I don't have this kind of, I don't place those kinds of restrictions on myself, but I think that there's a directness and a muscularity to Orwell's prose that I find really compelling, and that I try to like a varying in sentence structure, and so I go back to Down and Out in Paris and London a lot. I go back to Shooting an Elephant, which I think is a very complicated essay about the British Empire, and definitely not like I wouldn't teach it as actually the British imperial officials all felt really guilty. You know what I mean? But I think that no one has struggled more, like no writer more clearly captures the combination of a sense of superiority and a profound kind of hatred of the colonized, with a sense that hatred is corrosive and destructive, but at the same time that hatred is the thing that makes the empire go. Right. And I think that Orwell captures that. And I think that that's at work everywhere. Like I talked about this I'm reading, I'm on vacation in South Florida right now, and I'm rereading The Orchid Thief by Susan Orlean, which is a great book, really zippy, really fun book. And there's a chapter in it, a lot of it's about contemporary orchid poaching. But there's a chapter in it about the Victorian obsession with orchids. And to me, there's something about the Victorians' desire, their desire to know everything, to own everything, like they're like the greedy curiosity and the violence with which they prosecute, the violence that they're willing to commit in order to satisfy their curiosity and to just like possess the world. Like I don't admire it, because it did an awful lot of deep, lasting, profound damage to the world, and but I do respect it. Right. Like the Victorians were not. And so I think that trying to understand their minds. I think Orwell's writing after, when the rise, he has this moment, I forget in what essay it is, where he describes the end of the British Empire and all of the kind of flower of the British Empire cut down in the trenches of the First World War. And he's like men with like mustache like eagle's wings or something. It's not quite, I'm not sure if that's the exact phrase, but this generation of like people who would have been imperial officials who were just killed at the Somme, right? And there's this sense of respect and hatred and understand, and I find that moral complexity is really appealing. And I think if, as an historian of the British Empire, I think you have to be like, you have to kind of start from, sorry, I'm rabbiting on, but you kind of have to start from a position of like, your conclusion can't be the British Empire was wrong, right? Like that could be where you start, right? You have to understand the British Empire did an awful lot of damage to the world. But if that's how you conclude, you've missed something, right? Like I think there's like understanding that should be a premise from which you work, an axiom from which you work, and then sort of understanding imperial officialdom and understanding the interactions between and trying to understand the mindset of. I mean, look, I work on people who left some written records, right? There's all kinds of questions about audibility in the archive that can be answered, but anyway, so those are my picks. Yeah, George Orwell and Central Wilson. And A Massive Swelling is out of print, but it is an extraordinarily, maybe it's not a good book. Maybe I just read it at a good time, but I love it.
Well, Rot is coming out soon. It actually will be out by the time this conversation airs. So I know you'll be focused on talking about that. But you also mentioned you have another book in the works already. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that is before I let you go?
Yeah, sure. I'll do real quickly. It's a book called, the title tentatively is called The Day's Work. We're still thinking about a subtitle, the publishers and myself. I'm very poor at titling books. My wife titled Rot. She's quite good at it.
She did a good job.
Titles. Yeah. Like I'm not good at thinking of titles. So it's tentatively called The Day's Work. And it's my first actual book about Britain rather than about the empire. And it is about, although it recognizes that you can't live in Britain in the first half of the 19th century without the empire, being everywhere and nowhere all at once. But it's about kind of the experience of profound rupture in the structure of everyday life wrought by the Industrial Revolution. And in some ways, like in a way, Rot is kind of secretly my COVID book, right? Like it's both in that I wrote it, a lot of it while my daughter was born midway through the writing, right? My son was like at the heartbreaking online stupid junior kindergarten, which was a charade that we all participated in. So Rot was my kind of COVID book, and this one is kind of my tech book, because I think that there is both I think, and maybe I'm still stuck with Thomas Holt, right? A book that is profoundly influential on the way I think about the British Empire. God, I can't remember the title of the book. That's horrible. The Problem of Freedom. Sorry, I've read this book like 7 times and it completely skipped my mind. But near I forget if it's at the introduction or the conclusion of Problem of Freedom, Thomas Holt writes, we still live in the 19th century, right? Like our understanding of freedom, our understanding is still structured by the 19th century. Like we are still in this century. We can't get out of it. And I'm starting to wonder if maybe we are coming to the end of the 19th century. And so I'm interested in exploring the changes to everyday life that were wrought on people, just everyday working people at the beginning of the 19th century, to kind of point out and frame the ways that we are still like those profound transformations in the understanding of what work was, what workers do, what it means to work, the mind of the worker, just the material, like the way people eat, the way people structure their days. I think that's changing now, and maybe not as dramatically as at the turn of the 19th century, but I think we're in that kind of moment of transformation, and that's been shaped a lot by the fact that when I moved back from the UK to Canada, right, following my wife, who's an historian of British legal history and is a professor at UT as well, I moved into a unit, an industrial relations unit, kind of sort of equivalent to an industrial and labor relations school at U of T. And so like interacting with social scientists who work on work has really shifted the way I think about it. And I think that, so, I'm working with a new set of ideas. It's pretty exciting, but I'm still quite early in that project.
Fantastic. Well, I hope it continues to go well. I hope Rot gets a lot of attention as it's released. Dr. Padraic Scanlan, thank you so much for joining me on Drafting the Past to talk about writing.
And thank you very much for the invitation. It was really fun.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Drafting the Past. For links to the books Padraic mentioned, a transcript of the show, and more, visit draftingthepast.com. And a little dissertation update. Since you last heard from me, I've reread everything I've written so far to try to get back in the groove and taken some notes on books I want to reference. Some parts of revisiting what I've written were encouraging, others, not so much, which I guess is pretty much what you'd expect at this point. Of course, then my toddler broke his leg and is now on a 2-week break from daycare, so life has interrupted things a little bit. But I'll be back at it next week, starting to do a little more actual writing. My goal is to just be in touch with my dissertation and work on it a little bit every day so I don't get too distant from it. So stay tuned. And in the meantime, remember that friends don't let friends write boring history, but also it's okay if your first drafts are maybe a little boring. See you next time.